Ancient India was rife with warfare from competing kingdoms, republics, and empires, who all vied for dominance amongst the hot, humid jungles, plains, rivers, and mountains. This was an army of combined arms, of lowly infantry, massed archers, rattling chariots, quick cavalry, and earth-shaking elephants. So let's quickly take a look at these, shall we? There is a scene in the Mudra Rakshas by Vishakadatta, a play set in the Mauryan Empire, when Viradagup is narrating the fall of Kusumpur to the minister Rakshas, who is plotting against the emperor Chandragupta. He said that the forces of Chandragupta were like seas with waters in commotion at the time of universal destruction, investing Kusumpur on all sides. Rakshas draws his sword in a fit of rage, roaring, "Who on earth dare invest Kusumpur while I am alive? Let archers briskly protect the wall all round in the direction of the earthwork. Let elephants strong enough to break the array of hostile elephants be stationed at the gates, and let those who wish to have a hit at the feeble forces of the enemy and are desirous of fame sally forth, being at one with me, fearless of death." His defiance is for naught. The events relayed to him by his spy occurred in the past, while Rakshas himself is defeated, but is recruited to serve Chandragupta because of his intelligence and ethics. And in this story is the same sign and spirit of warfare in ancient India. Not to slaughter indiscriminately, not to shed blood as its own end, or revel in viciousness, but to wage war heroically, for survival, or to widen one's territory, or in cases such as this, to unify, to make a friend out of an enemy. War is often waged for pragmatic reasons, but not for cruelty's sake. Warfare on this continent did seem less barbarous. Codes of military honor forbid the slaughter of wounded opponents, to refuse quarter, to slay the weary or asleep or unaware. Poisoned weapons and those that caused unnecessary pain were condemned. Of course, these rules were broken, but instances of indiscriminate slaughter were hardly known. When a king was defeated, their native laws, beliefs, and customs were usually allowed to continue, provided that they paid their tribute. Wars were the affairs of the state, not of the people who were left undisturbed. Megasthenes, in the 4th century BC, noticed that when a battle raged, neighboring cultivators kept farming unmolested. All respect the field laborer, who is the common help of both armies. Besides, they never ravage an enemy's land with fire, nor cut down its trees. Despite these noble courtesies, warfare was nevertheless incessant. A king and a pacifist was viewed as a contradiction. Sukra, in the Sukra Niti, said that, quote, "Without an army, there is neither kingdom, nor wealth, nor prowess. The treasury is the root of the army, and the army is the root of the treasury. It is by maintaining the army that the treasury and the kingdom prosper and the enemy is destroyed." End quote. And so the ancient Indians took up arms again and again to assert themselves with their organization, careful strategy, and the power of combined arms. The historical period this video will focus on is the period of the Second Urbanisation, from 600 to 200 BCE, focusing on northern India, of which King Porus and the Mauryan Empire was a part of, though we will cover southern India in a minor capacity. Ancient India, like many continents, had many battles and wars. Dvisad-balam, the conquest of regions, was a righteous ideal. Within the roles and responsibilities of a king or emperor was to be a great warrior, capable of vanquishing enemies on the battlefield and subduing their kingdoms. Rulers strive to become a chakravarti, samrat, which is Sanskrit for emperor whose chariot wheels rolls unobstructed. Religiously, the Hindus favored war as a means of furthering royal ambition, and even advocated the concept of dharma yuddha, or just war, to avenge injustices or claim one's justified right to the throne. In the post-Vedic period, the conception of the army was of 4 branches, this model being termed chaturanga-bala, from the original Vedic model of just foot soldiers and chariots. Cavalry and elephants were added as branches. In addition to the 4-fold organization, there was a 6-fold classification of the army. 6 limbs, or nadanga, which consisted of hereditary troops, or maula, local volunteers, or bhrta, but which Chakravarti has termed as mercenaries. Guild levies, or sreni, feudatory chief soldiers or allied soldiers, or the mithra or the suhrd-balam, troops captured or won from the enemy, or amithra or the dvisad-balam, and forest tribes, or atavi-balam. In terms of quality, they were ranked in the order just mentioned. This ranking was given a formal classification under 4 classes: saram, or best, anusaram, or second best, tritiya saram, or third best, and the falgu, or weak troops. Cortilia believed that in drawing up an array, the general should place the weaker troops, or the falgu, in the forefront of each division. The second best, or anusaram, is to be placed in the rear line. Then should come tritiya saram, and then the best, the saram. Cortilia advocates putting the worst troops in the vanguard to bear the brunt of the enemy blows, and therefore use the best troops for the offensives. These classifications usually overlapped with the order of the 6 limbs of troops, the nadanga, but did not always correlate exactly. The Maulas were known for their loyalty to the king. They were likely connected by caste and race like in later times, according to Professor F.W. Thomas. They were the most reliable and possessed of the greatest skill and fortitude. The local volunteers, or if you follow Chakravarti's interpretation, the mercenaries, were considered to be obedient, stationed close to the king, and ready to march. Guild levies were a class of guilds in the industrial arts, but also had military expertise, though there is speculation they were simply another kind of mercenary. There were 2 types of sreni guild levies. There was the Ayuda Javi Samga, which were guilds dependent on profession of arms for livelihood. These were quasi-military corps on sale for the highest bidder, such as the Vahikas or the Yaudeas tribe. The other type focused on the industrial arts, but were also engaged in the military, which Chanakya refers to as Kshatriya Srenis, or warrior guilds. With the inability of the state to protect its citizens, the need for protection led to their creation. An example guild was the Veera Valangias of southern India, the name denoting valiant merchants who boasted of their prowess and heroism in inscriptions. From these inscriptions, we could see that they were part of a powerful martial community. They were closely associated with the Vela Ikalas, a federation of working class communities, which were exceptionally powerful and martial, as well as farmers. Military sreni could be powerful enough to defy the king. Engaging in their own private wars at times, they were influential enough to be a state within a state. The forest tribes, or the atavi-balam, are considered to be most numerous in central and peninsular India, living in forests and mountains. They have their own strongholds, and they are wild and undisciplined, faithless, greedy, and sinful, according to the text of Nitisara. These forces consisted of wild tribes that lived in the forests and mountains within the kingdom's domains. Let us now cover the individual branches of the fourfold composition of the army, starting with the infantry. With the inglorious origins of being downtrodden and overlooked in the Vedic period, this would then continue in the post-Vedic period. Ancient Indian infantry were never more than subsidiary. From the 4th century BC to 12th century AD, infantry remained a majority in Hindu armies. According to the Arthashastra, elephants, even horses, are seen as more important. Infantry were committed only to carry weapons to all places, at all times, and to drill. No Hindu writer recognized infantry's importance. However, archers were formidable, respected by the ancient Greeks. Most ancient writers emphasize infantry's best use is rough terrain and uneven ground. Regarding the equipment of infantry, sources are so scanty we cannot tell regional or periodic variations. Arrian, in his description of Indians in the 4th century BC, says of his remarks on equipment that it is not to be regarded as the only vogue. Therefore, there were other modes of equipment. The bow was a primary weapon. Bows were primarily made of bamboo. It seems likely that bows made of horn were a later invention, after which bamboo bows were still favored because they were cheap and still effective. Arrian said in the 4th century that the bow was as long as a man. This is supported by the Sanchi carvings, though some bows appear to be shorter. Arrowheads were made of horn, bone, wood, or metal. Cortilia mentions the use of fire arrows. Quivers were slung over shoulders and could be decorated with the figures of animals or birds. Bas-reliefs at Barut in the 1st century BC and Sanchi in the 2nd century BC show some modes of equipment prevailed over wide areas of India until well nigh of the beginning of the Christian era. Sanchi reliefs show that most infantry were archers. Some had javelins and swords. Both reliefs show that infantrymen and javelinmen had shields, but not archers. This is reinforced by remarks in the Arthashastra, describing a formation of men with shields in the front and archers in the rear. So if we try to correlate this with the dissonance in Arrian's statements, it is possible that he was only describing the northwest and not other parts of the country. While archers have been depicted as bare-chested, Cunningham in the Billa Topes said that archers probably wore a tight-fitting jacket. It is entirely possible that some wore jackets and some didn't wear jackets. Sarva Singh said that the archers wear braces to protect their arms from the bowstrings when using their bows, and they may have also worn some kind of protection for their fingers, possibly some kind of glove. The material for these braces is uncertain, but most likely it would have been hardened leather, with the occasional metal bracer worn by the more wealthy. While archers were the main element in the ancient Indian army, they also had close quarters infantry. Most infantry were armed with shields. These shields were usually made of undressed ox hide and were not as broad as a man, but were as tall as one. The shields at Sanchi vary in shape and can be emblazoned with the Union Jack style pattern of a six-limbed cross, or this could have been leather reinforcement. They were also decorated with crescents or circular bosses. Most infantrymen appear to have carried shields. The most typical design, which can be seen on the Sanchi reliefs, is a shield similar to a rectangle or triangle with a rounded top end. Some are narrower at the middle, but all have rounded tops and flat bottoms. The length of the shield seems to have been between 3.5 and 5 feet, according to Egerton. Some shields seem to have been of circular design as well. They seem to either be covered with straps or decorated with various floral patterns. Ancient sources seem to mention suns, moons, and stars as decorations on shields as well, according to Sarva Singh. Shields were often made of leather, either of oxhide or tiger skin. Shields of wood and metal would also have existed though. In the time of Kautilya, the shields were made of creepers, bamboo, wood, and leather. Some Indian warriors made use of swords. These swords were broad in the blade, but not longer than 3 cubits. And this, when they engage in close fight, which they do with reluctance, they wield with both hands to fetch down a lustier blow, according to Arrian in Indica. The Sanchi carvings confirm that swords were indeed quite short. On the other hand, Kautilya mentions swords of 3 distinct varieties. The Nistrimsa, which was provided with a crooked end, the Asyasti, which is shaped like a staff, and the Mandalagra, which is provided with a circular head. It is probable that the first of these resembled the kukri, while the second was certainly the typical Indian longsword. The exact shape of the Mandalagra is more difficult to determine, but it might have been the same as the modern leaf-shaped patissa. Sword sheaths were made of leather or wood. Swords were usually worn on the left, though they could be suspended from the shoulder or the waist. The Hindus made the best swords in the ancient world. They discovered the process of making uku steel, or wootz steel, which originated from southern India, Tamil Nadu, and was called Damascus steel by the rest of the world. Damas meaning water to the Arabs, because of the watery designs on the blade. The pre-Islamic Arab word for sword is muhannad, meaning from Hind, a clear reference to the Indian subcontinent. Spears were usually called sakti. There are, however, many variations in the use of the different types of spears, such as the kunta, prasa, and sula. For example, the sula appears to be some sort of pike weapon, while the prasa appears to be some kind of cavalry lance. Maces were represented at Sanchi, but rarely. They seemed to be tapered posts, hexagonal or octagonal, or girded with iron spikes. Singh lists gada, masala, and pariga as variations of maces. However, both gada and masala reappear in the Arthashastra as movable machines. It is quite possible that Kautilya uses this name to denote all forms of blunt weapons. This can explain the fact that clubs are sometimes described as ranged weapons in the epic tales. Most maces appear to be wielded with one hand, while the other hand holds a shield, but but there is also mention in ancient sources of mahagada, or large clubs, which may be a heavier, possibly two-handed version. Maces appear to have been made of iron, although their handles were most likely made of wood, and sometimes clubs made entirely of wood appear. Axes are mentioned, but seldom used, and if used, are often by the nobility. The element which completes our conception of a soldier is armor. The Sanchi reliefs portray most soldiers as bare-chested. Metal armor is monopolized by the upper class. King Porus himself was said to have worn a coat of mail that was strong and close-fitting and only left his right shoulder unprotected. Curtius adds that Porus's armor was embellished with gold and silver. Chanakya mentions 3 different types of armored metal coats, which must be interpreted as scale coats or chainmail. Iron armor is described by Cordelia as made of iron net or loha jala, little iron net or loha jalika, iron plate garment or loha pata, and iron armor or kavacha. The iron net or little iron net was undoubtedly a hauberk of interlinked chainmail. According to bhrta Svayui's commentary, the loha jala covered the whole body, including the head, while the loha jalika left the head bare. The same authority describes the loha pata as a coat of iron without cover for the arms. The epics sometimes mention cuirasses as well. The kavacha appears to have been a cuirass, composed of breast and back plates. The material that armor is made of, besides iron, is leather from various animals, including elephants and cattle. Chainmail coexisted with wadded coats of quilted cotton and armor of hides, the horns and hooves of rhinos and buffaloes. The Barut stupa depicts the use of leather scale armor. Furthermore, on the Sanchi stupa, soldiers are depicted wearing quilted armor, which were wadded coats of quilted cotton. In context with the armored coats, Cordelia also mentions other objects of protection, which include sirastrana, which is a protective device for the head, possibly some type of helmet, nago daraka, which is a type of armored glove, and kanthatrana, which is a cover for the neck. This was included on a list including elephant trunk armor, so it is ambiguous if this was for people or elephants. Apparently, tiger skins were sometimes worn as armor by individual warriors too, but this was probably a rarity, according to Singh. The Arthashastra says that decorations on armor were lacquered ornamentations in gold and colors of circular bosses, eyes and suns, much like shields, according to Chakravarti. Some warriors, of course, are valued more than others, being part of a vaunted elite. While the Indians did have elite units, this must be considered with the conception of ancient Indian warfare, where infantry was given little consideration. The elite forces of the army was not the infantry, but the elephant corps. This contrasts with ancient armies like the Romans, who relied on well-drilled legionaries, whereas the ancient Indians focused on the pure strength and unreliability of war elephants, which demonstrates the resources available to them and how it shaped their perspectives on war. The Mauryans utilized guardswomen or the maiden guard. Chandragupta is believed to have been the first to use them. They are only depicted as armed with swords. Megasthenes describes them riding horses, chariots, or elephants, while accompanying Chandragupta on hunts. Chanakya states that the king on rising from bed shall be received first by troops of women armed with bows, or the Shrigad-Edhan Vibhi, who must have formed his immediate bodyguard. The Mal-Apatu makes a mention of the Yavana, which are foreign Greeks or Romans, as part of the troops in the Tamil Kingdom's army. It describes their dress, uses the word Malkar for them, and calls them the bodyguard of the king. The Yavana can't speak the local language and communicate using gestures. Ancient Tamil authors sometimes speak of the Yavana bodyguard of Panja kings. Coming up next time, we cover the cavalry and chariots of the ancient Indian army. Jai Hind!